Welcome to Starr Commonwealth's 2020 virtual conference. I'm really excited to co-present today a session on aligning positive behavior intervention supports with trauma-informed, resilience-focused best practices. My name is Erin Madden-Reed. I'm a senior trainer for Starr Commonwealth, and I'm really excited to co-present with Jessica Hackworth from the Calhoun County ISD, who is an expert and trainer in PBIS as well as trauma-informed practices. So just as we get going, just a little bit about me. I'm a graduate of Evergreen State College, where I studied multicultural counseling. I am a 500-hour registered yoga therapist, and really passionate about that work, as well as mom to a now 16-year-old kiddo. As you can see there on the screen, he's taller than I am now, and just thought I'd share some fun pictures of him getting a quarantine haircut. I would have to say one of the silver linings in this time of sheltering at home has been that time spent doing things like haircuts and stuff that we used to rush around to do, and we've been able to build more connection there. So I always like to acknowledge Jackson as one of my best teachers in terms of what resilience means. And then also I like to acknowledge why I'm so passionate about the work of resilience in schools for young people by acknowledging my little brother Ryan, who always grew up really struggling in school with behavior. And I always wonder how his life would be had he always been looked at in the lens of his strengths and resilience, as he was one of the most generous people I ever have known. So just to give you a little bit of background on my why to the work and why I believe so passionately in the power for resilience focus to transform lives. And so I'll give it over to Jessica now.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here, super happy to collaborate on this with Erin. We've been talking about this for a long time, so this is really exciting for me. As Erin said, I work for Calhoun ISD, and I am the PBIS implementation facilitator for actually Calhoun Berrien branch. And so this slide represents just my crazy family. I have 3 boys, growing boys. Middle school, it's been really interesting to be quarantined all together. As you can see, they're very active. So we've been having to be pretty inventive with keeping them busy during this time. And then lots of families kind of what keeps me resilient. So wanted to share that with you. So I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, as Jessie mentioned, we have been talking about this, gosh, Jessie, for a year now or more.
At least, yeah.
It comes up over and over and over again. Well, and we know, teachers and educators feel like, okay, I've got to do the academic piece and I've got to do all of these different programs for that. And then, there's the social emotional learning and there's PBIS, and now you're talking to me about trauma-informed care. And when I got to sit down over lunch with Jessie one day, it really became clear that trauma-informed care and PBIS really can just fit together like a puzzle. Really seamlessly work hand in hand, that the practices for PBIS could be extremely trauma-informed when done well. So I'm really excited to share this today, because I've had teachers and coaches and administrators numerous times pose this question to me, but what about PBIS? So I'm really excited to help put that together with Jessie today. Just a tiny bit of housekeeping, which is less housekeeping than usual when we're training virtually. At the end of this hour-long session, we will be doing a live Q&A. So as you're watching the session, please, if any questions arise, go ahead and just jot the question down so that we can be ready to answer it when we get to the live Q&A portion. All right, without further ado, I'm going to give it over to Jessie to define PBIS for us.
So I start with the quote on the right, and that's where I first started to really see a lot of alignment with Starr's philosophy and with Floyd Starr's philosophy with there's no such thing as a bad boy. Because it's really not about, what is going on with this student that's causing the problem, but what is it with the environment that can be altered and modified to help the student be more successful? And that's really what PBIS is about. And so on the left-hand side, it's a prevention-based model. Most of the work is done in preventing those behaviors from happening to begin with. And then we do that through predictable environments, teaching appropriate behaviors, and then responding through positive acknowledgments. And then when things aren't going the way that we expect, instruction. And so really it's a 3-tiered system of support in order to create those environments and to provide behavior interventions that are matched to what the students really need. So that's PBIS kind of overarching in a nutshell.
And then, from the perspective of Starr, what does it mean to be trauma-informed and resilience-focused? So to be trauma-informed means that we absolutely believe that well-being can be restored by nurturing resilience, despite any adverse life experience. So that is a really key mindset, is that piece of hope that regardless of how many adverse experiences a student has or a child has, that they will be able to bounce back and be resilient if that is nurtured in a strength-based way. So some of the key philosophies of trauma-informed best practices is to be curious rather than all-knowing. Right? So understanding that the behavior is a need, right? And that we can get curious to help meet that need. We're also asking what experiences are driving the way that this child thinks about themselves, others, and the world around them. And then how does that impact how they behave? So coming into that lens of support that is really clear in PBIS, so then I start wondering, now that I've thought deeply about what's driving the behavior, what can I do in terms of environment, in terms of reteaching, in terms of support to really help this kid out? And what kind of experiences and opportunities can I give this young person to restore and nurture resilience? So that is the lens of trauma-focused care. So from here, now we'll just go ahead and bring them together. So this is where the puzzle starts coming together. What are these key mindsets and how do they complement each other? So Jessie, I'll start with PBIS.
Yep, so like Erin said, these are just some key mindsets that are really important to make sure that everybody is in agreement on, because these are really foundational to moving the work forward in schools that hope to install PBIS. So the first two, student behavior can be changed. It's that mindset that, there are no lost causes, right? Behavior is learned, therefore it can be unlearned. And so we can change student behavior. And for that to happen, the environments really need to be created in order to make that happen. So it's really about, there's a lot that we can control within those spaces.
Yeah, I love that you just said that, Jessie, because, right, that's so key to trauma-informed care. Sometimes you read a CA-60 of a student, you hear about their experiences, and they're manifesting these really problematic behaviors, and you say, well, that's hopeless. That will never change. How could it? And it's key mindset for both PBIS and trauma-informed that we know that with support, student behavior can change. So that's where this comes into play with behavior as a language for an unmet need. So always as we develop, we are developing behaviors that help us survive. So for some reason, whatever reason this behavior is manifesting, it's a language to us for a way that a child is trying to meet a need that has not been met. So that's really great and goes hand in hand with the environments that we create to change behavior. So once I dig deeper and say, okay, let me get curious with that unmet need, and then now what can change in their environment and in this child's experience? And I don't know about you, Jessie, but have you ever seen too that shift in mindset from an adult who believes a kid can't change to an adult that believes that they can?
Yes, and it's so powerful because I think the world just kind of opens up. It's like, oh, like there are some things that I can do. And then when they start having success, it snowballs and it's really awesome.
Yeah, that's why it's so key to believe that change can happen, that behavior can change, and that we can, as adults, create environments that support that.
Yeah, so we talked about it in a really positive manner, which it's awesome when that happens, but it is tough work. It's not easy. And so in order for that all to happen, there needs to be some change in adult behavior. This sometimes goes against, and I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit, it kind of goes against our instincts. And so there needs to be some structural changes that happen in order for those environments to change in a systematic way.
Yeah, it isn't easy to change your mind. And when I am training in trauma-informed care, it's all fine and good for me to say in a training, the adult becomes curious rather than all-knowing, but actually putting that into play can be really hard. Many times as adults, we take on this lens of I'm in charge, or I know, I'm trained for this, or this is how I grew up. And really that mind shift is such a key piece. Once an adult is willing to do that and move from being, I know, I'm diagnosing, I have the answer, to I'm curious, I wonder what's happening, that's when you do see that world open up. It is hard work. So as you're going through this journey with both PBIS and trauma-informed care, know that there will be moments of discomfort as you start to question maybe things that you thought before or things that have happened before. And know that is part of this journey. And then the next trauma, our PBIS mindset.
Yep, and so this kind of goes with the other one. You have to make sure that things are happening in a very consistent and systematic manner. Students rely heavily on that consistency, and so change needs to happen in an organized, systemic way in order for it to be less stressful on everyone.
Right, so meaning like I can't just change on Tuesday, but then on Friday I kind of go back to my norm.
Yes, right. Consistency. And again, it's hard work.
Yeah. And this is where, we bring up the coaching and relationship piece that is both part of being a resilience coach, and as well as, from what I understand, to be a PBIS coach, right, Jessie?
Yep. Yes, absolutely.
So we talk a lot, and you've probably even heard throughout the first day of the conference, a lot about relationship. The world, rises. What is that phrase? The sun rises and sets on relationship, right? Absolutely, the coaching relationship is key to this. So when you might be working with a PBIS coach or a resilience coach for trauma-informed work, that relationship where you're safe to talk through your mindset shifts, or talk through, wow, that didn't really go that well, why, and unpack that connection is really key. So that trust that you have with the person that's walking alongside you on your journey to implement both PBIS and trauma-informed practices is really, really important. So, checking in on that relationship is, if you are a coach, then how are you nurturing those relationships? Or if you're an educator going on the journey, how are you feeling about the trust and comfort level and ability to be vulnerable with your coach? Those are really key, because in order for adult behavior to change in a systemic manner, it needs support, and it needs like reflective debriefing and things like that. Can you think of anything else for that one, Jessie?
Nope, because I think my next bullet, you perfectly set that up. So it's really hard work. And so lots of times we think about kids needing support. And while that is absolutely true, we can't forget about the adults. So to have all this mindset shift and think about behavior in a different way, that's going to require a lot of support for the adults as well as the students.
Yeah, and that is why, for our certified trauma practitioner journey for education now, we make the self-care course a requirement. Self-care and community care for educators is essential. Before school closures, I was talking to so many teachers who were feeling so overwhelmed and so undervalued. that absolutely has to be addressed in order to do this hard work. I often think of our teachers as raising our futures, and I, as a parent and as a community member, want them to feel just as nurtured as I want my child to feel. So self-care has to, and community care has to be a part of the conversation. And not just the conversation, but also the true actions that we put into place and structures that we put into place throughout the course of implementation. So here are some big ideas of PBIS is how PBIS addresses them. And then in trauma-informed care, we call it strategies. So we'll go through these and kind of show you how these are all able to link up.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I think of these as strategies as well. So what we talked about was kind of the what, and this is the how from my angle anyways. So the first strategy, and these, by the way, are pretty sequential until we get to the last one. The last strategy that I'm going to talk about is done throughout the process, but for the most part, these are sequential. And so the first strategy that schools implementing PBIS would do is to identify and to define behavior expectations. So you've probably heard of these, something like be safe, be respectful, be kind. Some big ideas that is valued by not only the school, but by the community and the families as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. It's really important to make sure that those big values or expectations are something that's important to all stakeholders. And then not only just having those, but then defining them. So what does it look like and sound like to be safe in the hallway, in the cafeteria, in the classroom, so that students know really exactly what the expectations are.
And for trauma-informed work, that speaks hugely to the strategy of safety, restoring and ensuring safety. So a student who is experiencing trauma or toxic stress is always going to be wondering, what am I supposed to do? What's going to happen next? And this part of PBIS clearly supports them in saying, this is the strategy, and then this is exactly what this means. Just like Jesse said, all the sentences, what does it look like? What does it sound like for all of these different spaces? And particularly in unstructured time, right? Where kids could potentially feel very vulnerable. So this really aligns with the trauma-informed strategy of safety. And Jesse, you had a great analogy. How does it feel, when, somebody sort of asks you to do something? What was that? Do you remember that analogy that you were using? I loved that.
Yeah, so I do like to give as many adult examples or come up with as many adult examples as I can, because this is not just a kid thing, this is a human thing. We all like to have clear expectations, and when we don't have clarity of our expectations, it can cause some anxiety and even some defiance, right? So I don't think this is the one I gave, but I always think about Aldi. The first time I went grocery shopping at Aldi, it's not like your typical grocery store, right? And I'm a pretty proficient grocery shopper, so I didn't anticipate that I wouldn't know, I have to get the cart and I have to pay, and the setup is just a little bit weird, and it caused a little bit of anxiety in me. And so just making sure that we know what the expectations are, I think, is a human need that we have. And when we don't know, it causes stress. If we want to be able to play the game, we got to know the rules. So
yeah, I love that. It's not a kid thing, it's a human thing.
So the next PBIS strategy is then, after you've established those behavior expectations, you've defined them for kids, we have to teach them, right? So we do a great job in teaching content. We know that we need to explicitly go through the content, we model it, we practice it, we give feedback. We don't always do that when it comes to behavior, but in fact, it's the exact same process. And so going through kind of all the areas that you want to teach and having those lessons where it's taught, it's modeled, it's practiced, kids get feedback on it. That's a really crucial next step in implementing PBIS.
And then from the trauma-informed lens, we talk often about the circle of courage. and I'll just briefly touch on it here, as it will be woven throughout many of your experiences in the conference, interacting with the Circle of Courage in many different ways. But the Circle of Courage basically identifies all human needs, which are belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. So when Jessie talks about, okay, it's really important to explicitly teach these behavior expectations, we often talk about mastery, being able to teach mastery of how to behave, right? So when I know how to show up and go through my day in school, I have mastery over myself and my body, and I'm able to make choices about what the best thing to do is. I know what the expectation is. I've been taught how to behave with the expectation, and eventually I can master that. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do in the cafeteria. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do on the carpet. This also speaks to independence in many ways, because independence, the human need of independence, partially addresses our need to be able to be autonomous, and people who are autonomous are emotionally regulated. So I kind of have to tie it back to safety here, but when I have been taught, I know what's happening, I know what to expect, then even when I'm struggling with emotion, that might be overwhelming, I know how to regulate myself within those situations, right? So that teaching of behavior also speaks to how we co-regulate emotionally and then eventually regulate, right? So I often talk about emotional regulation as it's emotional awareness plus a practice that equals regulation, right? So I'm being taught that, right? So it might come to pass that some students need some kind of intervention to line up, right? Or some kind of practice to know when to transition. And so that really supports that universal need of independence. And then finally, generosity, which speaks to how we take care of the entire community, how we're able to help one another. Teaching behavior expectations is part of helping someone be able to meet all of their needs. So, and I even can see in many situations how young people help each other do that peer-to-peer support through, hey, I see you're having a hard time. And when a teacher and an adult is modeling, this is the expectation, and they're teaching it very clearly, young people will then follow suit. So this really aligns with the Circle of Courage in this way, the teaching of behavior expectations, making it really, really clear and safe, and then being able to master that expectation eventually.
So then the next piece is about monitoring. So once we've taught it, it's going and making sure how are kids doing with it. Sometimes we teach something, and especially, with behavior expectations, it's kind of like, you should know how to do that. I don't need to pay attention to that. But after we teach it, we have to kind of check to see how are kids doing with that. So just that follow-up piece.
Yeah, and especially that's information as well. Say that I have a student who forever has been really great at transitions, and then all of a sudden they're off, right? And I'm paying attention, I'm monitoring it. That's information. That's part of curiosity. Now I can ask another question: what's happening or what's happened? Right? So again, that's really aligned. If I'm monitoring through a trauma-informed lens, I'm going to get curious, and I'll notice when things are off with my students. And then that also speaks to belonging and connection. When I know someone's noticing me every day, not just if I'm doing something right, but they're noticing me if I might have an off day. They're checking in on how I'm doing, not what I'm doing. I'm really building, in that sense, the sense of strong relationship and belonging through being able to just be aware and be curious through monitoring behavior.
So then the next strategy is, as we're monitoring, if students are following those expectations, giving them that acknowledgement when they're doing it, and encouraging the behaviors that we've taught. So again, we talked about this a little bit. Sometimes it's not always our human nature to give that positive acknowledgement. We're kind of driven to rove and correct, right? But if we switch it to rove and acknowledge and reinforce, those behaviors are the ones that we're going to see more of in the future. What you pay attention to is what you're going to get more of. And so that's a key strategy, is when you see students following those expectations, giving them that reinforcement so that they know that they're on the right track.
Yeah. I love that what you pay attention to, you're going to get more of. And you're starting to speak to the negativity bias with that, rove and correct. That is how we're wired. That is a long-term survival strategy that human beings have. When I see a problem, I have to remember, and it's even the way our brains work, it's fused into the way we remember when we solved a problem, because we're trying to really fuse that into our memory to know how to do that automatically in the future, which is great when you're running from bears in the woods, but when you're in a classroom of kids and you're just noticing negative and that's wiring into your memory, it's something that we have to really work against. So we're always working against the negativity bias with acknowledgements. And that's why we talk about a strong skill. And I know this is across the board. I think PBIS is 4-1. And then I think the only difference is we sometimes say 5-1, because then if you shoot for the moon and you hit the stars.
Yes, absolutely.
And because we're really talking about building relationships. So when we know that our brains are triggering all the time, like, oh, that's a problem. Oh, that's a negative. Oh, that's a problem. That's why we really put in place this really foundational strategy of 5 positive noticings to every 1 redirection that you do. So really, really making sure that you're building those pathways for positivity. So that's what you get more of. And we are wired like that, especially really young kids. If you've ever been in a room of kindergartners and you just say, I love the way Jeffrey is sitting on the rug, all of a sudden, look at him, he's ready, I can tell, he's sitting still, his hands are resting in his lap. All of a sudden, most of the kids are with him because they want that acknowledgement too. So we're wired because that's connection. And when we're talking about the experience of trauma for young people, maybe they've never had that positive interaction. Maybe they're not even sure how to get that kind of attention. So making sure that that's the norm in our schools and classrooms is such a powerful tool. Other trauma-informed strategies that are really powerful to support acknowledgement is the time in piece. Maybe even, giving that human contact and that human connection, in the form of acknowledgement. Hey, I love the way that you're on task. I love the way that even though that was a hard problem, you didn't quit. That really shows that you are resilient, or whatever, that tying it back to your expectation. Or even if you're intervening, hey, just getting low, getting curious, getting eye level with a young person, going, hey, what do you need today? I'm noticing you, that maybe today's a hard day. What's going on? So time in, 5-1. And then we talk about intervention in terms of, some of our kiddos' days will not look the same, as everybody else's. So once we notice that, we're monitoring the expected behavior, we're seeing maybe the challenges that individual young person has, we're creating supportive interventions to help them meet the expectation. Rather than kind of that attitude, that they should already know how to do this, right? We're really supporting them and hitting our expectation. Also, the trauma-informed strategy of teaching social and emotional skills. I think that's another thing that we kind of assume that our young people know how to do. And depending on their experiences before they come to you, they absolutely might not have the skills that we might assume they have. And then finally, it comes back to curiosity, which I think I've mentioned several times. When in doubt, just get curious. It's the cornerstone of empathy, and we'll definitely be able to guide you through, I think, both sets of practices.
So that the next one is to have a continuum of responses that are clearly laid out for teachers on how do I respond to the behaviors that might come up that are unwanted in my classroom. So it's really about giving teachers lots and lots of tools and having great clarity around, if this happens, here's some responses that you could try with that student. The most important thing about this piece is that it includes teaching and reteaching, right? And so it's not just a punitive practice. If you do this, here's your punishment. the end goal is that we want students to be successful. And so any sort of strategy when it comes to responding to behaviors that are unwanted is, how do I teach that kiddo to do it differently the next time?
And I think that this is where that idea of continuum of responses really goes hand in hand with Starr Commonwealth's behavior support plan. When you are noticing, this trend, you've been monitoring the behavior, and you've really taught it and brought all of these PBIS strategies into place, and you're noticing, wow, my kiddo is having a hard time hitting that target, the Starr behavior support plan really can help you to assess for what need that child is trying to meet through their behavior, and then gives you a continuum of responses, really. What can I do every day to help that child meet that need? And that would, fall not only on the classroom teacher, but possibly, be with the use of support staff or with building staff, to be able to say, some kids are going to need support to meet expectations. And here is a continuum of possible responses and interventions that we can put in place that are based on the student's need. Jesse, you started to talk about the punitive practices. Trauma-informed work and trauma-informed care, really, we have to think hard about punitive practices, kind of this idea of you would never exclude or tell a child, you don't know your letters and sounds. Please go sit in the corner and think about it. Or you failed that math test. Please go figure that out. And it's the same with behavior. They don't know, or else, that they would do better. They just don't know. And so the idea of responding with intervention, and the intervention being based on meeting needs and not hurting at all.
And so the last strategy is using data for decision making. So I said before, these are all sequential except for this one, because data is used throughout installation of PBIS practices. So use of surveys with parents, with students, with staff, and then using your behavior data so that you can see if your strategies are working. If we're modifying an environment such as the playground because there maybe was some extra behavior referrals in that area, and you put an intervention into place, you want to see if it's working, right? So that hey, this is working, let's keep doing this. And then also it shows your staff, hey, this is making a difference. And so the data piece is really important throughout the process of PBIS installation.
Yeah. The very last step in the behavior support plan is, how are you going to monitor? How are you going to collect data on whether what you're doing is working or not? Because over time, and with all that an adult or a teacher might see in a school day, it's really important to ground your awareness in what's really happening. Knowing that this is the human experience and so much could be going on, being able to say, because when you're climbing a mountain and you only get halfway up, it's hard to not just keep looking at the top, but then to be able to look back and say, wow, look,
Yes.
This really is helping. We really are seeing less referrals. We are really seeing less intensity of behavior. We are seeing shorter duration of issue, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's a good point, because behavior is emotional. And so it's really hard not to go with the I think I feel. And so the data kind of helps you to stay in reality a little bit. Yeah,
and oftentimes it can really give you the boost.
Yes.
Yeah, to say, okay, I can keep going. I'll stay the course with this intervention. It is helping. It is working. So I think, that's a really crucial step in the behavior support plan that we believe in too. So let's move now to just chatting about when PBIS is done correctly, it is aligned with trauma-informed, resilience-focused practices. Okay, so some examples of alignment that you can think of. For example, when I see school-wide celebrations, right? And everybody's there and belonging is being nurtured and everybody's enjoying each other. The trauma-informed strategy of play is in place. That's a really great example I can think of for PBIS and trauma-informed practices. Any other examples that come to mind, or even just real life experiences of when you see trauma-informed care really aligning with PBIS, Jessie?
I think the biggest thing that sticks out to me, and we're going to kind of go through some non-examples, so I can give more specifics when we talk about that. But I think when it's just really, when it's everybody, when it builds a sense of community and belonging for kids, and everybody feels like that's their place and that the adults care about them, that's when I know that PBIS is being done really well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the key word being positive as the first part of the acronym, that it's a positive experience that you're creating. And that's, really the work of trauma-informed care. The very first step in trauma-informed care is focus on resilience. Every single individual has something to offer, has some strength that we can find. And I see huge shifts sort of in practice when you come into meetings or a child study, and maybe the laundry list of what's wrong is being doled out, and somebody finally says, tell me about this kid's strengths. Where are they strong? And then you move from there. And it's when that's being celebrated every single day and acknowledged every single day, you can really have that felt sense of community and belonging, just as you stated. So then moving on to the next piece, how do we recognize when PBIS is out of alignment with trauma-informed and resilience-focused practices? So we're going to go through the PBIS big ideas and strategies, and kind of just talk about some of the times where they fall out of alignment with trauma-informed care, and maybe give some ideas about how to bring them back into alignment.
So in regards to establishing and teaching behavior expectations, some missteps that can happen sometimes is not getting that input from family and community. And so sometimes it's comes off like, well, these are the expectations that the school has established and these are our rules. And it really needs to be a more holistic approach, and making sure that you get that feedback to say, are these expectations important to you? And with that, making sure that it's communicated that just because these expectations are the way that we do business here at school, it's not to say that the way that you do business in your community or in your home is bad. And sometimes we can send that message when we don't fully incorporate communities in schools, or communities and families into the process. So one really cool thing that I've seen happen is, in order to help make that distinction with kids, they might say, here's the expectations on our playground. How does it work maybe in your community playground? How are the expectations a little bit different? And so in that way, it's saying these are different, but they're all okay, right? And so it's really giving honor to the expectations that are within communities and homes.
Absolutely. And this, to me, in terms of, best practices, is we talk a lot about one of the strengths of a trauma-informed, resilience-focused school is that they connect with communities and families. So I can't think of a more deep honoring, or to connect and say, what are your values at home? What really matters to you? And then the next step of being, how much more will that kid buy in if that's the norm at both home and school, or close to it, and at least it's honored? There might be some things we do at home that we would never, personally, there's things I do at home that I don't do at work, right? But knowing that they're both okay and there's a time and a place, because what we do see in young people is, especially kids who have experienced trauma and toxic stress, it's really hard to adjust to two completely different sets of rules. To say, hey, this is one world at home, and now I get to school and it's a whole other world. So, being able to say, okay, these are the things that are values that both communities have, and then being able to connect those and help the students understand maybe if there are differences or maybe there are similarities. So I think that's hugely important, and it seems like one of the best ways to start to get buy-in from your families and your community.
So food sharing is a great example of where those expectations might be different. And so in a lot of cultures, it is expected almost that you share food, right? It gives honor to those that prepared it. In schools, especially now, right? We can't share food for health reasons. And so just outlining those differences, because it doesn't mean that the practices that we do at home are bad or wrong because they're not allowed in the school. And so defining that kind of highlights that. And so sometimes that's just done totally inadvertently.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think this leads to helping, where sometimes, in communities and cultures and in the circle of courage, we spend a lot of time talking about generosity, because being able to give and help another person proves my own value and worth in an altruistic community. But sometimes it turns out that, a behavior expectation, even if I'm helping a friend, with a behavior expectation, that might be perceived maybe at school as like meddling or not minding my own business. So I think we have to kind of watch out for that, because when the expectation becomes more focused on rule following and not on value, then we lose our real strength in both PBIS and trauma-informed care. So when we move to more, what is the value that I'm teaching here, not what is the rule I'm teaching here. So if I can think about, times where, just seeing young people get reprimanded or redirected from helping one another. And that's a time where I find, that's our rule. She was not where she was supposed to be. She was helping somebody else. But to me, it's more important that she learns the value of being helpful. Or I even just say, hey, I see that you're being helpful and I can appreciate that. But right now, the most helpful thing you can do would be to meet this expectation. Right? So honoring the value and putting that above just a rule and law and order.
Yep, absolutely.
And then I think that's where we added the generosity bullet point, that is a value, as I touched on just before. When we are creating and teaching behavior expectations, making sure expectations are achievable. I guess I think about, the young person who is experiencing toxic stress or trauma. Maybe, they're living in a situation of domestic violence. They, had to leave in the night with mom. And stay with somebody else, with a relative. They got up and didn't get breakfast and rushed off to school in the clothes they wore yesterday. And it was the expectation of my school to be on time, but I'm late because of everything I've been through. That's where we have to kind of make sure that we're getting curious. I don't want it, it's my expectation. And why aren't you meeting it? It's being able to say, this is, is this even achievable for you today? So where that time and piece and that curiosity piece has to be a part of the expectation. And then if I know I have a student who's living in developmental trauma and toxic stress, I want to make sure that the expectations are achievable for them. So as I'm teaching it in the way that they can understanding it. I'm giving them small goals to be able to meet the expectations. So this bullet point was more about the need for individualized care when it comes to trauma-informed care. And I do think that can be confusing. We want to say, this is PBIS, this is the expectation. I've taught it, I've monitored it, but where we still have to make room for that individual experience with our young people to make it trauma-informed.
So the next one, a misstep that I see sometimes is, yes, we're doing PBIS. Here's my beautiful poster, right? But that's just kind of, that's it, right? And so once you've established it, that poster is a tool, right, to be able to remind students to use the language. When I see schools doing PBIS really well, it's just the way that they do business. They're using that language all the time, and it's just weaved throughout. And so one misstep I do see is where it's just it's there, but nobody really pays attention to it. So making sure that it's weaved into your everyday interactions with students.
Jesse, that's why I love teaching and practicing affective statements, which is actually the very first part of restorative practice. But it just, even in life, I mean, anywhere, just, hey, you know, I'm observing you do this. I'd like to make a request based on that, or I'd like to acknowledge you based on that and connect it back to the value or the expectation, you know?
Yes.
You know, when I see you really persevering and working through that problem, that meets our expectation of determination. And wow, I really just want to acknowledge you for that. Like, you know, can you tell us how you're doing it? Because it's really impressive. So really bringing it to life through language in every single day. And then you're not only hitting the bell of PBIS, but then you're hitting the bell of trauma-informed care and restorative practices. So I know how much we have to care for our educators, and it's good to realize that you can do one thing and do all the things with just those strategies. It's not another thing. It's how you just do them all together.
Yep, and we talked a little bit about this, but just really understanding that, you know, I can't just slap that poster up and magic is going to happen. I need to teach those lessons. I need to model it. I need to give feedback, just like we do with academics.
Yeah, you know, I can think of an example of this where I saw, you know, where we were getting into a problem. A teacher was trying to implement proactive community circles. And I came just to be a part of one and support her. And her students were all yelling over each other. And I, you know, afterward I just said, what happened to the talking piece? Where'd that go? And she was like, well, I thought we knew how to talk one at a time. I didn't know that we didn't. You know, we're in middle school now. We know how to talk one at a time. But her students were clearly saying, no, we don't. You know, we don't know how to talk one at a time. And listening, I mean, I can't even tell you how many adults I know that, you know, we could work on our listening skills. So, you know, making sure that even those things, it can be the most minute thing. How do we move our chairs to the next center? How do we, you know, really, really key going into it, maybe sometimes more than you think you have to, right?
Yeah, that comes up in parenting too, right? I'm like, oh, I thought you guys knew how to do that. But, you know, the other thing that I always come back to is the behavior continues because the behavior works, right? And so if it's working for them, they're going to keep doing it. And sometimes I have to put my brakes on and say, I think I need to redefine that a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm thinking right now, just an off the cuff example, but, you know, it works for Jackson to put his dirty dish on the countertop instead of in the dishwasher, because even though I've joked around, bend, extend, put it in, it's still working for him just to pop it on top, because, you know, I won't go back and reteach it. I'll just take the dish and put it in and be annoyed, right? But, and that's why this is such hard work, right? Because sometimes it is easier to be like, okay, I'm just moving on, right? So yes. It's important to acknowledge that even these little things that you would think, oh my gosh, am I really teaching this? But you know, parenting, teaching, all of it, I feel like it's repeating ourselves over and over. Yes. But yeah, I have to remember that the behavior, what did you say, the behavior?
The behavior continues because the behavior works. They're getting something positive out of that. And it's kind of like back to that curiosity thing. You have to ask yourself, what are they getting out of this? It might not be, it might not sound like a positive consequence to me, but for them, it is. And so you have to think about that.
Yeah, and because if you think about even your student who acts out all the time, or, you know, is constantly pushing back on you, maybe they're getting out of it the negative attention, and they don't mind. They don't mind that.
Right.
Like I have her attention, or maybe I feel like I have some control.
Yeah.
You know, and so that is such a great question to ask in curiosity. What is this child getting out of this? You know, that, yes. How, when monitoring for expected behavior, we might fall out of alignment with trauma-informed care and PBIS best practices.
Yep. So this one's, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? Usually where I see schools fall off is they just don't monitor it, right? And so once we've done all that great work of establishing and teaching, now intentionally going out and looking for those specific behaviors that you've taught to your students.
Yeah. And I think that probably echoes with the negativity bias that we discussed earlier. you might see a new problematic behavior arising, right? But then coming back, wait, is that one of my expectations? Is that something that I've taught? Is that something that, because it will still stand out, but making sure you're looking for those specific behaviors. Yes. And then finally getting curious. I mean, I can't say this enough, obviously, but getting curious about, okay, so this behavior, the expected behavior, and the student is continually not able to meet it, even though I've taught it and retaught it and been really clear about it. Why? And I think we talked about this before, in the last slide. Why is this persisting? Why is this still happening? What needs is this child meeting through this? And then from there, what new experience could I give this young person that will support them in meeting the expectation? Oh, and then see it through, right? So it is so easy knowing how hard this is and knowing how much people have going on, and that we're human beings living in a human world, but that, hey, yes, I tried this for a week. I tried this intervention. I got curious. I looked at the need. I made this intervention. We did it for a week. It's not working. I think this see it through in the monitoring part is really important. 4 to 6 weeks at minimum to see if the intervention is when you're implementing intervention, to see, is this really effective or not? Because there's so much could be going on throughout 1 week. You really need to give 4 to 6.
So then, just offering support. This is where I always tell schools, if you can systematize things, systematize it, right? So thinking about what kind of support what prompts might teachers need, whether you can do that, like if you already have a newsletter for teachers, or if you already have a weekly email, just kind of reminding teachers of what to look for. But again, adults are going to need that support system just as much as kids.
Yeah. And in PBIS, while we're talking about offering support and systematization, in terms of systems, things like clip charts, class dojo, public ways of monitoring, what does PBIS tell us about that?
So we are in wonderful alignment with trauma-informed practices on those. Those are not methods that we would encourage. Anything that's public, I mean, it's a public display of humiliation, right? And so we can monitor things without everybody having access to that. So if you are keeping track of some behavior, you can easily do that with your own, sheet or clipboard, but absolutely not having that available for public view. I could tell you 10 million horror stories about how that has gone horribly wrong. And I know some educators will say, it works great for me. But I will say, of your 10 stories of success, I got another 100 of just devastation. So not a practice that I can encourage.
Yeah. And so that's always really, I think, this is people using those tools as behavior management. I see those as definitely more focused on rules and not as much focused on values. And then, of course, that shame-inducing experience where we know then that, how that growth is impossible from there, right? That isn't an environment that will create a behavior shift. So I just always like to highlight that those are still in alignment, or that we're still in alignment on that, that those tools are not encouraged by either practice.
And even for kiddos that really are pretty successful with their behaviors, I have seen that really negatively impact those kids. God, I'll never clip all the way up to gold, and so I think it just puts unnecessary pressure on kids on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and you always bring up the adult example.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, if you walked into a professional development which I may have done before, and saw your name on a dojo list for everybody, and the facilitator, if you peeked at your phone for a minute, just took away some points, it probably wouldn't make you feel so great as an adult. So I'm always like, if there's a practice that we would never do for adults, why in the world would we ever do that with our kids, who are to be our, more precious population? So that's always a measuring stick for me. If I wouldn't do it to an adult, I sure as heck wouldn't do it to a kid.
Yeah. Right, because this isn't really like, these aren't it's not just kid needs, it's human needs. Right, it's human needs, and that's where we can really, and coming back to trauma informed practice and like that cornerstone of curiosity and relationship, right? It's when, your needs are like my needs. Now I can have empathy and compassion for you, and that's really building, that community that we really, are seeking to develop, and is a real place to learn and grow.
So when we think about having that reward close to the desired behavior, one example that I can give that I've seen a school do really well is they were working on respect and the behaviors associated with that. And they were working toward a goal of, if we get this many acknowledgements as a school, we're going to go and actually go to the movies, because that respectful behavior needs to be carried over to the movie theater. If I go to the movie theater, I have to use my manners. I have to keep my voice down. I have to be respectful. And so it tied directly to what they were working on. So that's kind of an example of it done well and relevant.
Right. And so what about in terms of, when it's not relevant? So say, this amount of kids were able to put, this many tickets into a bucket and they won a pizza party and we've lost all connection. Do you ever see that, examples of that?
Yes, I see it disconnected a lot, but here's the thing. I think it's really, really easy to connect. You can still, a pizza party would be something, as long as it's not exclusionary, something that you could tie, right? So if we're working on, something like kindness, that event of getting together and breaking bread together, we still have to use those behaviors. And so I think it's just a small little tweak to those practices.
Yeah. And I find too that intrinsic and extrinsic can, I think, initially seem a little bit intimidating. And I think that when I'm trying to figure out intrinsic motivation, I have to come back to the value in the expectation I'm teaching or rewarding or even acknowledging. What is the value of it? I used to work with small reading groups and I had them on sticker charts. And I got this new colleague in and she sort of was like, those are dumb. Those aren't working, right, for what you want them for. I wanted them to do their best in the group. I wanted them to talk and listen to each other, were my main expectations that I was trying to teach them through getting a sticker every week. And then at the end of the week, you could go to my prize box, right? Well, it became so these young people were coming in, they didn't care at all about reading or listening to each other. Their main question for being there was, will I get a sticker?
Right.
So it was so far from the reward proximity of the sticker that's tied to loving a really good story or learning about a character, or even that community, that listening piece, or listening to a friend or listening to a teacher. So once I got rid of them, and these were first graders, and I had to kind of come in and say, hey guys, I'm sorry. These aren't really, we'll still have stickers because stickers are fun, and they won't be related to reading or anything else. Just every once in a while, we'll stick a sticker on something because stickers are fun. I'd usually do it after, what I had learned was that it's okay to use small rewards after doing like a really sort of mundane task. Like if I stuff all these envelopes, I can have a sticker, but when it was something that was around meaning and value, that I needed to do that more through how I spoke.
Yes.
And through my acknowledgement. And then that was how I was fostering that intrinsic awareness. So it did shift. And even first graders were like, okay, we get it. moving on, and now we can talk about this lovely story or how important it is to listen.
Absolutely. And there's a
That
lot
was
of
my own experience.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
There's a lot of research around that, right? If it's something that a student enjoys and is proficient at, that's not necessary for them to receive anything outside of it. They're already getting that good intrinsic motivation just by participating in it. So yeah, just kind of being careful with those. So this is another biggie that I see a lot with PBIS is, okay, we've worked on our goal. Those of you that did it, you get to come to the celebration. Those of you that don't, you get to go over here or go in this room or do whatever. And so that is something that we really caution against. I always use an adult example of that too, right? So if I were in a school and we were working on being on time, and I was late a couple days, first of all, who knows why I'm late, right? I would hope that my employer would get curious about that and send the message that they care about me and kind of help me with that. But maybe there's a staff reward for those that were on time all month. How am I going to feel as a staff member? Now, some people who maybe are a little bit maybe nicer than me would go, man, that really does motivate me to get my butt to work. Probably wouldn't work that way with me. I'd probably, not do some things that I otherwise would have for that school community, because to me, that sends the message that you really don't care about me. And so I know this happens with kids, right? And so we really try to shift that it's not this reward that you're following. We are celebrating the success of all of our students, and everybody contributed in different ways, right? And so that school-wide celebration really needs to include everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I can think of the direct experience of watching a graduation ceremony, or what I thought was a graduation ceremony for 8th graders. And the only kids who got to walk across the stage were kids who had improved their M-STEP goal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like watching their friends sit in these wonderful kids who had wonderful gifts and talents, not actually walking up onto stage at this milestone moment that they had completed middle school.
Yeah.
Because of just one way of measuring what would be celebrated. And again, kind of coming back to that didn't align with my value, and our community values, in that moment. So thinking of those, how really devastating some of those exclusionary practices can turn out to be. I know that in many places, the intention of it is, well, if they know this, won't they hit the expectation, right? But it so destroys that sense of belonging. And that sometimes, is incredible. Then you'll see that uptick in behavior.
Well, for sure.
I don't belong here anyway,
right.
So you don't care about me anyway. If you have a rebellious tendency, if I'm tardy all the time and you don't ask me why, I probably just stop showing up, right?
Yeah.
So that's really important. Those inclusive celebrations so deeply support our human need for belonging.
So another practice that I see a little problematic in schools implementing PBIS is their use of tickets. And so a couple things can happen. One is, again, just because, just human nature, adults will acknowledge the same students over and over and over again, and then possibly leave out acknowledging students that are following the expectations that they wouldn't normally do. And so to combat that, what I encourage schools to do is to kind of pre-fill all their acknowledgements out ahead of time. That way you can easily see who have I not had a chance to acknowledge yet. And the acknowledgement doesn't need to be the same for every single kid. You can acknowledge any student for doing, following some part of those expectations. And so to really systematize it and make sure, okay, here's my acknowledgements for the week. I'm going to identify a time of the day, maybe during independent work or right when they first come in the door. And I'm going to look for 5 students to positively acknowledge. And that way, you've gotten through in a few days your entire class. You've had a chance to interact positively with them. And the other thing that I always say is those tickets are a prompt for the adults. They're not meant to be used as a carrot to dangle in front of kids to get them to do what you want them to do. It's a prompt for the adult because, it doesn't come naturally to us to rove and look to acknowledge. And so it's that physical, visual reminder for the adults. So sometimes misuse of tickets can be an issue.
Yeah, and your language is rove and look for the good things, and the language I always think of is the negativity bias. So based on your negativity bias, you're just wired to notice what's going wrong and really cement that into your memory. So having tools like, I've got my whole class right here. We're making sure I've found some positive interaction to have with everybody in that equitable way. Because we all have students that push our buttons, right? That sort of know how to get to us. So it's a good way to check in and go, wow, I'm really struggling to acknowledge that kid. And then be curious about why that is for you, and then going forward from there. So I think that's a great strategy. So the next one is establishing a continuum of responses to behaviors that includes teaching and reteaching, and some of the ways that those can fall out of alignment with PBIS and trauma-informed care.
Yep. So a big piece that we always kind of check for is to make sure that the continuum of responses are not just all punitive practices. There needs to be, like we said before, a reteaching or a teaching aspect in there, because our end goal is not just to, punishing out of a kid. That's not going to work. We know research tells us that doesn't work. Our end goal is for that child to be successful. So what do we need to teach, to reteach, to modify in order for that to happen?
And I think sometimes, and I don't know if you've had this experience, Jessie, but where educators get a little confused about the difference between a punishment, and even adults, what's the difference between a punishment and a consequence or an outcome? So I think it's helpful to be reminded that a punishment is to inflict pain. So if you're trying to hurt a kid, you would take a punitive approach. If you're looking at consequence is a natural outcome, you could have a natural consequence, right? I didn't do any of my work and I got a bad grade. That's a natural consequence. Or a logical consequence, one that I heard a principal describing, a kind of thoughtless high school student was goofing around with matches and dropped a match into a trash can, and it caught fire. And according to the behavior rubric, he would have been expelled as an arsonist. A kid who had not had any prior issues. Instead, she had him go and learn and kind of shadow some local people at the fire department to learn about fire safety. So that was a consequence that was invented to help him learn from the behavior, right? To be successful. Oh, wow, this is why I want to do that next step thinking around fire or matches and those kinds of things. So when you are seeking to say, how can I really hurt this kid? How can I really, try to punish this behavior out of them? Then, you're deeply out of alignment with trauma-informed care for sure. Kids, when they feel better, they do better. So by hurting a kid, you will never see their behavior improve.
Right. And that's not to say, another thing we hear sometimes is, well, with that approach, there's just no consequences. There are consequences, but just making those as natural and as likely for them to be successful, that's the goal, is to move them towards success.
Yeah. And there always is, as soon as you're turning your eyes in that way, you'll either see the natural consequence or be able to come up with a logical consequence. Yeah. And the thing is sometimes it feels like it takes more time, but once you get used to looking with that lens, it becomes more natural for you too.
So we talked about this a little bit, just making sure that whatever consequence occurs is as private as possible, right? So we say praise can be public, but when we're going to do corrections, that should always be as private as possible to just to protect the dignity of the student. I know if I make a mistake on my job, I would not appreciate my boss saying it in front of everybody, right? And so just making sure that corrections are as private as humanly possible.
Yeah, and I think every human can remember a time when they felt shame and, think about what your reaction to that, what your go-to reaction to that was, whether it was to fight back or whether it was to just hide, it never brings about the response that's leading to meeting an expectation. It's usually then disconnecting further.
Absolutely.
And shame is a trauma theme. So especially for your students who have and are healing from trauma experiences, further exposing them to that theme and that experience will only prolong their healing process.
And then, you can chime in too, Erin. I think we would probably say the same thing here. The interventions that students may need, you're going to have some students that are going to be successful, without any intervention. You're going to have some that need a little support, and you're going to have some that need a lot of support. And so just making sure that those interventions are really matching the needs of the students.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of, sometimes I think you see it out of alignment when you see the intervention. Okay, I have this behavior plan on my desk. I have to, meet these expectations. I have to stay in my seat. I have to raise my hand. I have to do my job. And you have that, the student has that in front of them, but no one's done any of the work to say, well, this student is struggling to raise his hand and stay in his seat because he has a need to move to self-regulate throughout the day. So we've just got the expectation, we've written the expectation, we've retaught the expectation, but we haven't looked at the need behind it. This young person has a need to move and is not getting that met just through recess. So looking at that intervention going, that kid could probably use after lunch or, after a math test, a good brain break. So making sure that whatever you're putting into place is need focused. Absolutely. All right, now we have what happens when we're out of alignment with using our data for decision making in PBIS and trauma-informed care.
Yeah, so the first one is not including all of our stakeholders, especially our families. So like I said before, making sure that families are surveyed. Not only do they agree, that the expectations are important and that it's, just a whole approach with everybody. And then, surveying them just on how are things working and what do they think about the practices. So just really getting their input, I think, is really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes they have a key insights, and it builds relationships with families as well, which is really an important thing.
And then using student perception data is really important. So when we don't ask students, it's really amazing the information you get when you ask students questions like, do you feel safe? Do you feel like there's an adult in the building that cares for you? You can really use that data to make some really profound changes.
Yeah, at Starr, one of our key principles is that children are resources. And oftentimes you'll go into a room full of adults, very well-meaning adults, maybe doing like a child study or an intervention team meeting, and you come in and they have all of these ideas and no one has asked, did anyone ask the child? What helps? When are you scared? What is that experience like? So they, remembering that student really can be a key in their own success.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the other piece is just not using your behavior data to see, number one, where are our main areas that we need to focus on, that we can look at the environment to make some modifications. And then once those modifications have been made, following up to say, are we making a difference? Is this working? Do we want to continue with this modification? Do we need to change it? And so that data piece, and we promote the use of Swiss as a data warehouse. If you haven't seen it, it is just fantastic. The granule size that you can get down to time of day of the week, area of the building, it's amazing. So making sure that you're using that behavior data to pinpoint and to modify environments is a key piece to having PBIS success.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Jessie. It's so good to see you.
Hello. Good to be here.
Good morning. So we had a lot of questions. I guess we'll start with the one that is the trickiest. Um, how do we have the conversations with administrators and colleagues who are out of alignment with PBIS and trauma-informed care, are using, I think, one of the things that was coming up are using exclusive practices with, I'm going to need to fire up this morning, with using exclusionary practices to leave kids out who aren't earning or who aren't being acknowledged, and also some of the more punitive, shame-inducing practices of clip charts and dojos. So how do we have those tough conversations? Definitely can be really tricky, especially since many adults were raised this way, right? So the mindset is, I grew up this way. If I did something wrong, I was punished or shamed, or I was left out. So I think that can be, those conversations can be really tricky. Jesse, do you have anything on the top of your mind about how to have those conversations or how that works?
I think it's always, anytime we go to implement PBIS within a building, we kind of do some informal surveys with staff to see what are people thinking about PBIS. What do you think it is? What are some practices that you're concerned with? And then start having that conversation before implementation even happens. Because if it's not addressed, it's going to come up, at some point or another. And I think there's multiple avenues. I mean, that's a mindset shift, and that's not easy work. And so a few things that we like to talk about is the kids that show up and do their job every day, they're intrinsically motivated, right? They are getting a reward simply by doing their job and having success, right? Kids that aren't, they need a little bolster. They need some support. So that's one piece we talk about. Using adult examples, I think, always helps to just put yourself in the shoes. And so asking if that happened to you as an adult, how would you respond, and how would that make you feel? And finding those adult examples as much as possible. And then back to, what's your goal? So what do we want from kids? And are the practices that we're doing getting us what we want? And if not, then a shift might need to happen. So those are just some suggestions, but it takes time.
One of the questions, now that my brain feels switched on to speak instead of type, one of the questions that I ask people in buildings are, can you tell me who are the kids who are always left out? Who are the kids who are not earning tickets or points or in the negative in the dojo? Can you tell me who those kids are? And always, or who's always in school suspension, right? Always, they can make, oh yeah, it's these 5 kids, they're always there. So then my next question is, so do you think what you're doing is working to help them change their behavior? And then it's kind of a moment of, oh, I guess not, right? So if I keep sending that kid, I keep excluding that kid, I keep demeriting that kid, I keep, putting them in suspension or punishing them, and the behavior just continues, then I know that what I'm doing to support the behavior isn't working. And so then now I want to open the door to have a conversation. Well, why do you think that kid behaves that way? What need is not being met that is causing that kid to behave that way, to meet that need? All behavior, right? Behavior happens because it works. So exactly. What is that kid doing that's working for them? And now how are we going to get to that root cause and find a healthy way for them to meet their needs? Right. And these are ongoing conversations. And with adults too, it's just like kids. So when I think about the person who had the biggest influence on me changing some of my practices that weren't working when I was in school, it was somebody I trusted. It was somebody I cared about and liked and felt close to. So when she came to me and said, Erin, your sticker charts are not really best practice, this isn't right. At first I was a little bit like, whoa, but then I was like, wait, this is somebody who cares about me as a colleague, cares about our students. I had a relationship with her. So if you're really, trying to help someone shift their mind, get close to them, make it safe to discuss what's going well and not well. And just like we say, time in with our kids, get some time in with that person to try to really listen and discuss why they do what they do. And I think that that's a powerful strategy too for shifting. Okay, so let me see this if there's other questions. Okay, so Christine is asking, can you mention more about shifting attitudes with adults in the systems that are so focused on punitive measures? I think maybe we did just talk about that. Is there anything we missed on that, Jessie?
No, I think
that, yeah.
I would have answered it the same way, and just keep planting those seeds and do it as soon as possible, right? Have it be, sometimes it's that slow burn that creates a shift in mindset. So just keep coming up with those examples and having those conversations, building those relationships within your staff. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, even just if you can show examples of how it's working, sometimes, there's always like 3 ways to look at people, right? So you can look at people in your building of the people who are like, always will jump on board with the new idea, always try something new. The people who are like, tell me some more about that before I might try it. And then the people who are like, heck no, I'm never changing. This is how it is. Try to go with your maybes and your yeses for a while, and then like the no's start to see, wow, we are seeing some shifts based on these practices, and now we have real life living examples to say, maybe you can come alongside these shifts, and there's more momentum for the shift too. Okay, so here's another one from Lindsay. How can we build support for our educators within a very small program as the whole team changes focus? Okay, great question. So I'm thinking this is relating to how we build some systems of community care and nurturing our teachers. I think that buddy teaching, mentor teaching, making spaces for debriefing around the shifts and changes that you guys are trying to make is really powerful, to create those trusting spaces where we can go, gosh, that really didn't go well today. And where it's safe to go, I need help. To create those spaces can be really powerful. And I think it's actually maybe an asset to have a small program because you guys can be each other's resources and then create those relationships. Any other thoughts on that sort of what educators need as they do this hard work?
I would say just get input and feedback as much as possible. People love to be heard and genuinely heard. So creating a system of communication to say, this is how we're feeling about how this is going, and this is what we need, I think would be huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So here's another one from Corinne. Great question. In some cultures, punitive mindset is the way to go. How do you explain that to parents and teachers from other cultures?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Okay. And I feel like we talked about that a little bit, but I think just giving honor to that, to say, number one, we've agreed on, getting input from the community so that that you have agreed on those values, but then having conversations about, so how does that look in your culture? And so it's sending the message that it's not wrong or bad, it's just, this is how we define it in our home, in our community.
Yeah. Corinne, I'm going to just, share as like part of my journey with trying to understand that as well. I was speaking with a colleague, a Black woman, who helped illuminate for me and help me understand. I was noticing some more punitive practices in some of the minority students in a particular school building where we were doing some coaching work. And she helped me understand that a lot of that lies in the fear of the true inequities that exist in our society today. Black and brown children, Indigenous children, students of color are much more at risk in society. That's data-driven facts. So parents use those, she explained to me that many parents use those punitive measures because they're trying to teach their kids that it's, they really have to toe the line. It really comes from fear. And that was really illuminating to me, to help me understand why in certain situations that's coming to play in families. I think listen, and so I learned that not by saying anything, not by trying to change anybody's mind, but just by listening. So I think listening. Tell me more about why you do that. Tell me more about why you feel that it's so important that your kid follows that expectation of yours. And I think listening is a really powerful tool there. Okay, so Joe is asking, can you share ideas for addressing high school behaviors such as vaping, skipping, apathy? Oh, as the mom of a high schooler, I can feel the need for addressing high school behaviors. I think again, it comes into talking about the value and why we do what we do or why we don't do what we do. It's not just law and order to not vape or skip or to, put effort into what you're doing, but it's the value in why you do it, right? So why would it be? And a lot of it's about education, like all of drugs, drinking, all of it. What could this be doing to you? Do you value your health and well-being? And a lot of talking about it. What's the value in coming to class? What's the why behind this behavior? Is something like vaping or substance abuse an escape mechanism that kid is using because of their experience? Is skipping an escape mechanism? Like why, or is apathy a broken sense of mastery? Why is this happening? So getting to the why is that behavior working for even that high school kiddo?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I would say, as well as just making sure within your expectations, it's flipped, right? So what's the opposite of that behavior? What's the opposite of apathy? What do you want to see in the student? How do you want them to engage in class? And so having those spelled out for kids. So anytime you see a behavior that's not desirable, identifying what's the opposite and making sure that you define that for kids clearly.
Yeah. Even as a mom, that's so important. So important right now, right? Getting more time with these teens than without our precious educators. So, all right. So what are some virtual expectations that we can integrate into our PBIS model that are trauma-informed practice? Virtual expectations that we can integrate into our PBIS model that are trauma-informed. Oh, that's a good one, Sammy.
Talk a little bit about that, Erin. So I rely pretty heavily on my MTSS as just kind of a good resource that I go to. They're the assistance center for the state, and they've already started developing some really nice tools for online learning. So if you visit their website, which is mymtss.org, I believe, they've already developed some sample matrices for how do we define our expectations in an online setting. So that's a quick resource to go to, but it's really the same, right? What behaviors do we want to see out of kids in those online learning settings? And then making sure that we follow that same process of going over them, modeling it, making sure that the students know how to do those things. And then when they are doing them, acknowledging them for doing those behaviors.
And I think from the trauma-informed lens, the piece would be then connecting whatever that expectation is to what need that meets, right? So we're still looking to build that intrinsic reason for why we do it, right? I'm not just telling you need to show up to your virtual classroom because that's the rule. I'm telling you that because I want you to feel like you belong there, that you're connected there. That there's value and there's a need being met into whatever expectation you're laying out virtually. Or there's an opportunity for mastery. Maybe today we have a problem with technology, or we're making a sudden shift to a virtual classroom, but that's a sense of mastery and being able to solve that problem or bounce back from whatever that challenge was. So whatever expectations you're creating virtually, connecting them to the circle of courage will also hit your trauma-informed care button too. Okay, let me see. Does Starr have resources directed at social emotional skills? Yes, so we have this really cool program for elementary called Skill of the Week. I think the creators of it, they presented on it yesterday, but it's a program that you can do that's like lesson plans for elementary school students that takes them through all of the social emotional skills as they relate to the circle of courage. Oh, they're presenting today. Thank you, Ian. So you go ahead and check that out. That's an amazing social emotional skill resource. And then this afternoon, Kathy Hart, our Director of Professional Training Coaching, is going to take you through Starr's Trauma-Informed Resilience-Focused Behavior Support Plan. And we were talking a little bit about how that relates to continuum of responses, right? So if I'm seeing a kid who's got an uptick in behavior, you'll be able to assess what need that kid might be trying to meet, and then be able to say what could be our continuum of responses, right? So what is the classroom teacher doing? What's the virtual teacher doing? What is, going to happen with the secretary? What's happening with administration? So how we're all have a continuum of response to help that kid meet that need in a healthy, balanced way. Those are the ones that pop off at the top of my head. We're so lucky. Jessie is also a STAR trainer too. So not only is she a PBIS trainer and expert, but she's a STAR trainer. Are there any resources I'm missing, Jessie, that you can think of?
No, that sounds great. And I'm actually really looking forward to checking that out today, because that sounds wonderful. A great tool that I'm gonna add to my toolbox.
Oh, awesome. Okay. I don't know. I don't see any more questions popping up in the chat. I don't know. Let me see. So I wonder if we are concluding here. I just want to say thank you very much for your time and your participation in our virtual conference. We are really, really grateful to get to do this work and keep doing this work, and grateful to all of our educators. We know that this is a really challenging time, and we're just honored to be able to come alongside and offer whatever support we can.
Yes. Thank you so much.
And thanks so much. Thanks, Jessie, so much for presenting with me. It was really great to bring this long held idea for this conversation out into the world.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.